If you've ever had the opportunity to talk to someone who grew up in the 1960s, you've probably noticed something different about them. There's a particular way they see the world, a certain resilience mixed with idealism that you don't find in other generations. And that's not just nostalgia talking. Growing up in that decade literally shaped their brains differently. Picture this. You're a kid in 1965. Your parents probably had 3 or 4 kids, maybe more. You live in a neighborhood where every kid plays outside until the streetlights come on, and nobody's parents know exactly where anyone is. There are no cell phones, no internet, no helicopter parenting. You're essentially free range. That very freedom created something psychologists now recognize as a core trait in people who grow up during this era: an unusual tolerance for uncertainty. Research shows that overprotective parenting can negatively affect children's mental health and self-confidence, while independent activities enhance these traits. When you spend your childhood like the baby boomer generation, figuring things out on your own, getting lost and finding your way back, settling disputes without adult intervention, you develop a bit of a different relationship with risk. More importantly, this kind of childhood fostered what psychologist Julian Rotter identified as an internal locus of control. The belief that you're in charge of your own life, rather than being controlled by external forces. When children entertain themselves and generate their own meaning without adult guidance, they develop this crucial trait. Research consistently shows that people with an internal locus of control tend to have better life outcomes, including higher academic achievement, better health, and greater psychological well-being. But here's where it gets really interesting. While these kids were roaming their neighborhoods, the world around them was absolutely exploding with change. The 1960s were a pressure cooker of transformation that happened so fast and so dramatically that it fundamentally altered how an entire generation processes change. Let's take a minute to think about everything that was happening. The decade started with kids practicing duck and cover drills in school. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever been. Children went to bed wondering if they'd wake up to World War III. Then you had the assassinations: John F. Kennedy in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King in 1968, Robert Kennedy in 1968. To make things worse for the youngsters of that era, television news broadcasts brought these real-world events into people's living rooms in vivid detail, with the Vietnam War being the first televised war in history. This created what psychologists call a dual consciousness in many. On one hand, there's optimism and belief in progress. On the other hand, there's a deep-seated awareness that everything can change in an instant. Recent research on baby boomers reveals they score remarkably high on what's called stable-mindedness, a trait that measures emotional resilience and equilibrium under pressure. Both men and women from this generation score around 60 to 61 on this measure, and it's the highest of any generation. This allows them to go through contemporary disruptions without the psychological reactivity often seen in younger generations. But let's get back on track and talk about other things that shaped the boomers' psyche. The civil rights movement had a monumental impact on this generation. They learned that society's rules aren't fixed. Rules can be challenged. Rules can change. For many kids, this was the first time they realized adults didn't have all the answers. They saw their parents struggling with questions about right and wrong, fairness and tradition. That does an interesting thing to a child's mind. It creates independent thinkers who question authority because, early on, they learned that authority figures are just people, and people can be wrong. But there is one thing that we mustn't miss out on when we talk about what shaped this generation: the sheer amount of unstructured time. Kids in the 1960s were bored, really bored. And boredom, as it turns out, is incredibly important for psychological development. When you're bored, your brain wanders. It creates. It imagines. Research on free-range parenting shows that children who have greater freedom and independence tend to grow up less anxious and depressed. In fact, psychologist Peter Gray at Boston College has documented that over the past 50 years, as we've seen a decline in children's freedom, we've seen an 8-fold increase in depression and a 5 to 10-fold increase in generalized anxiety disorder among children and adolescents. Compare that to how children are raised today, with every hour scheduled, every activity supervised. Kids in the 1960s had time and space and a kind of benign neglect that, paradoxically, may have been psychologically beneficial. Of course, it wasn't all freedom and optimism. Many families in the 1960s operated under a children should be seen and not heard philosophy. Emotional expression, especially for boys, was often discouraged. Mental health wasn't discussed. Trauma wasn't processed. You just dealt with things and moved on. It wasn't until the 1970s that trauma was widely accepted in psychology as something that might need treatment. But even then, for many, it was a shameful subject. So while these people are remarkably stoic and self-reliant, they often struggle with emotional vulnerability. They learn to handle their problems internally. They learned not to burden others with their feelings. For some, this became a strength. For others, it became a source of lifelong difficulty with intimacy and emotional expression. Then there's television. Believe it or not, this was the first generation raised with television as a constant presence. But there is a slight twist. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were only 3 major networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS. Programming ended at night with the national anthem, and then you got static. So when something happened on TV, almost everyone saw it. When the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan in 1964, half the country watched. When Walter Cronkite, known for his impartial reporting, delivered the news, that was the news. This created a shared reality that's almost impossible to imagine in our fragmented media world. It gave both people and children a sense of common experience, a feeling that we're all in this together, even if we disagreed on something. And trust me, they did disagree. The generation gap of the 1960s was real and intense. Teenagers and young adults were questioning everything their parents believed. If you were a child watching your older siblings clash with your parents, you were learning that it's possible to love people and still completely disagree with them. You were learning that good people can have fundamentally different values. Then there was the Vietnam War. You saw the war on television every night. You saw protests. You saw violence. As you might imagine, this created a generation with a complicated relationship with patriotism and government. Many learned to separate love of country from blind trust in leaders. And let's not forget about delayed gratification. People who grew up in the 1960s are exceptionally good at waiting. You wanted to hear a song? You had to wait for it to come on the radio or save up money to buy the record. You wanted to watch a show? You had to be home at the exact time it aired or you missed it. The famous Stanford Marshmallow Test, conducted in the 1960s and 1970s by psychologist Walter Mischel, measured children's ability to delay gratification. While more recent research has complicated the original findings by showing that socioeconomic factors play a significant role, the core insight is still valid. The ability to wait for something and resist immediate temptation is a trainable skill. And children in the 1960s got constant practice in this skill simply by living their daily lives. This trained a psychological muscle that's increasingly rare: the ability to want something and not have it immediately. The ability to anticipate, to plan, to save. It created people who generally have better impulse control and a different relationship with desire and satisfaction. Money worked differently too. Most families operated on a single income. Kids saw their parents spend money carefully, save for big purchases, and simply do without things they couldn't afford. This fostered a psychology of financial caution among many people in this generation. They learned that you don't buy what you can't afford, that debt is dangerous, and that security comes from savings. And with that in mind, it's important to highlight that kids in the 1960s were raised by parents who had lived through the Great Depression and World War II. Their parents knew real hardship, real sacrifice, and real fear. This created a parenting style that was both protective and tough. Protective because these parents desperately wanted their children to have easier lives. And tough because they believed kids needed to be prepared for a world that could be harsh. This gave people who grew up in the 1960s a particular psychological inheritance, a combination of opportunity and responsibility. They were given more than their parents had, but they were also taught not to take it for granted. The space race was yet another huge psychological influence. Kids in the 1960s genuinely believed that by the time they were adults, we'd have moon bases and Mars colonies. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969, kids watching understood that they were witnessing something impossible become possible. That makes you believe that barriers can be broken, that the impossible is just the not yet accomplished. But there's a shadow side to this too. Many people who grew up in the era feel like the future didn't deliver on its promises. I mean, we don't have flying cars or moon colonies, do we? Social connections in the 1960s were completely different. If you made plans, you kept them, simply because there was no way to send a quick text saying you'd be late. Your word was all you had. As this generation became teenagers, many embraced the counterculture. Research shows that the baby boomer generation is unique compared to prior generations in one not-so-great way. They report to have had more exposure to alcohol, tobacco, and illicit substances in their youth compared to previous generations. Nowadays, these people are in their 60s and 70s. They're grandparents. They're retiring or already retired. And they're watching a world that's changed in ways they never imagined. They've lived through more transformation than almost any generation in human history. Research comparing baby boomers and later generations reveals fascinating differences. Studies using the Big Five personality traits show that people born at different times indeed differ, on average, in how conscientious, agreeable, neurotic, extroverted, and open they are. Later-born cohorts exhibited lower levels of maturity-related traits, such as agreeableness, and higher levels of agency-related traits, such as extroversion and openness, than earlier-born cohorts. Interestingly, baby boomers also score higher on trust than all younger generations, particularly among women. This trait measures belief in others' goodwill and reliability, including trust in institutions. This positions baby boomers as critical institutional stewards during an era of declining institutional confidence. Recent longitudinal research tracking mental health across the adult lifespan found that baby boomers experienced marked increases in psychological distress during the 2019 pandemic, reaching the highest distress levels they'd experienced in any period of their lives. However, in the post-lockdown period, distress levels largely returned to pre-pandemic levels, demonstrating the resilience this generation developed through navigating previous crises. This has created a psychology that's remarkably adaptable in some ways and resistant in others. Many people from this generation have embraced new technology and changing social norms with enthusiasm. Others feel alienated, like the world has moved past them. Most are somewhere in between. What's universal is that within them, they carry the memory of a different world. A world that moved more slowly and offered less choice, but more clarity. A world that was in many ways harder and less fair, but also in some ways simpler. They remember what it was like before everything was documented, before every moment was shared, before we were all connected all the time. In the end, they've lived through enough change to know that nothing is permanent. They've seen enough upheaval to know that society can transform. They've experienced enough loss and renewal to know that endings and beginnings are part of the same cycle. That makes them both nostalgic and pragmatic, sentimental and tough, idealistic and realistic. They're a generation shaped by contradiction, raised in a decade that contained multitudes. So if you or someone you know grew up in the 60s, make sure you drop us a comment to share your thoughts about them. Feel free to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos about the psychology of our species. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.